that young, right? But we're really sorry to hear about that. Lee's about the same with her situation with her back. It just hurts tremendously. So we're waiting on the 25th of this month for surgery or before. They promised her that if there's a cancellation, that she can be operated on before. So we're hoping that that will occur. All right. In our readings for this morning, we actually finish Leviticus and we begin Numbers. We came down to Leviticus, for my reading, my numbering here on the 10th, or the 9th rather, was the 25th chapter of Leviticus. The 26th and 7th, which is the last chapter of Leviticus, is in this larger section where he says it takes what to stay in a relation with God? Holiness. And we mentioned earlier in our review of our readings that there's about best I can count, the Hebrew word that is translated holy is used about 152 times. And it takes sacrifice to come to God, and then it takes holiness to maintain a relation with God. In chapter 26, we had the blessings for obedience, and yet in verse 14, but if you don't, there are consequences. There are the curses. And then in 27, there are vows. The last chapter deals with vows. Vows especially, we think oftentimes of vows as being between us, but these were vows made to God. Did God command any vows be made to him? Yes or no? Did he command vows be made to him? No, that's right, Sandra. There was never any kind of legislation that you shall make certain vows. However, there was a regulation made if people did. If they did make vows, they were not to do what? Not to break them. And so Jesus alludes to that in Matthew 5, doesn't he? He said, you've heard it said, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. Perform unto the Lord thine oaths. And so, anyway, that's in chapter 27, that people might vow animals, a house, other things, but they were not to defer from paying it. All right, Numbers. The book of Numbers, whereas if you think about in Exodus, the children of Israel come to Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. You remember that? 3 months after they actually depart from Rephidim, they come to Mount Sinai. And they are there through the rest of Exodus, which gives us the giving of the law and the construction of the tabernacle. Leviticus, best we can tell, takes about a month of time. Primarily, the sacrifices are given, or at least the instructions of sacrifices are given. And we have very little time. And then the book of Numbers, through chapter 10, verse 10, they're still at Mount Sinai. It's interesting, if you do something that I find kind of interesting, if you take your Bible and you go back to Exodus 19 and you put your hand there and you take what's left, that's Exodus 19 through Numbers, the 10th chapter, you've got a whole lot of pages. Do you notice that? How many pages that you have? I mean, that's page 63 to 125, however many that is. And it's interesting that only how much time has gone by? From Exodus 19, they come to Mount Sinai, to Numbers 10, they leave Mount Sinai. About a year, not quite a year. And so you've got all of that much material so that kind of gives you the idea that probably is fairly important, because you got a lot of divine ink that has been used to write, to record and preserve what was given to Moses in Israel, the law, the instructions concerning the tabernacle, and then they're in chapters in chapters 1 through 10, verse 10. Numbers is divided basically in three different sections, easy to remember. You have the old generation and the getting ready to move from Mount Sinai in chapters 1 through 10:10. Then 10 verse 11 through all the way down to 21, you have or 20, you have some call it the tragic transition. They go from leaving Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. They send out the spies, and they say, we can't what? We can't take it. So you have basically 39 more years of what? Wandering in the wilderness. Then by the time you get to 21, they come to the plains of Moab. And so from 21 to the end of Numbers is the third, that's the new generation. So you have the old generation in that first 10 chapters. And then the second part, you have the wandering in the wilderness. And then you have, they come to Moab they're poised, ready to go into the promised land. So that's really what Numbers is about. We're just going to go real briefly. In those divisions of Numbers, if you look at your Bible, in chapter 1, what happens? The census. And if you wanted to make a note of verse 45, that is a key verse, 145, of the number of men who were able to bear arms, 20 years of age and older, 600 and what? Good, 603,550. In the American Standard, the Levites are accepted, not accepted, but they're the ones that are excluded. In chapter 2, what do we have? I'm sorry, what was that? The arrangements of the camp. I had a picture that I had come up with. Well, you can't see it perhaps from there, but I had in some notes that I had on for class literature. Here's the tabernacle, obviously the east side, and then the Levites. You remember Gershon, Merari, and Kohath were the three sons of Levi. And the Kohathites were the ones through whom Moses and Aaron came. And so the priestly tribe would be through the family of Kohath. Anyway, they were around the tabernacle, and then everyone was ordered all around that. And so you have the distinct families from or the distinct tribes. All around the tabernacle. The tabernacle then was what? Well, you can say everything is kind of organized around that. The tabernacle becomes what should have become what in their lives? The central feature of their lives, yeah. Everything was based around that. That ought to be a lesson for all of us, that the kingdom, the church, things spiritual ought to be the centerpiece of our lives. Just as they were arranged in a physical, geographical location, everything was centered around and specific obligations for the Levites and the priests and so on. All right, and then we come down to 3 and 4. And what do we have in chapters 3 and 4 of Numbers, guys? Anybody? Yes. You've got in chapter 3 the duties of the Levites. Specifically, you'll notice just pick out a few. In verse 21, Gershon. In verse 27 and following, Kohath. Verse 33 and following, Merari. And where they were to line up and what they were to do. And the duties specifically begin of the Kohathites in chapter 4. And as well as the Gershonites. What all they were to do relative to the tabernacle. Who was to carry what? There was an old phrase, don't hear it too much. Everything has a place. Every place has a... Y'all haven't heard that? Everything has a place. Every place has a thing. In other words, there's an orderliness to everything. You probably have your kitchen arranged alphabetically, don't you, Lindsay? You've got A for apples and B for bananas and all that. I've seen some women who are like that in their kitchen. They have everything. I mean, it's almost depressing when I think what I try to do to help Lee. But everything is just so orderly. And that's how God did this in these chapters. Okay, comment or question? Any more? Okay, good. I hope you're enjoying the readings again and profiting from all this that we're doing here. We are in Nehemiah, the 10th chapter, and as we turn to Nehemiah, we want to remember that we're in a bigger section, the bigger section of what's happened here. Let me make sure our chart's on. It's not. Okay. In the bigger section, we have in the very, I don't want me to be complicated, but just to keep us all on the same page, I'm sorry, I am so sorry. I usually turn that thing off. We're in this bigger section of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and in the prophets who were contemporary with those, we have Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And so Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, the historical, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the prophetic. And so Ezra describes in the first 6 chapters of the return around 536, when who was the governor who came back under the Zerubbabel. Yeah, Zerubbabel comes back, and Jeshua the high priest, and they bring about 50,000 or so with them. They come back, and then we have the rebuilding of what in Ezra? The temple. And then chronologically, the next thing that comes is the story of Esther and how God spared the people from annihilation, primarily because of this one fellow who couldn't stand them, and his name starts with an H, Haman. And so we have Mordecai and Esther and her family and so on. And then we skip ahead chronologically, and then we come to the 400s, about 445, 444, and we have the work of Nehemiah, who comes to Jerusalem from Babylon. Not Babylon, I got that wrong, didn't I? Starts with an S. Shushan, yeah, or Susan. And so he comes, and what we have is the reconstruction of the wall in the first 7 chapters. It took how long? How many days to get it all done? 52 days. And so we're down to about 444 BC. And then the rest of the book, 8 through 13, deals with we might say, the reconstruction of the people, restoration of the people, the reading of the law. And the reading of the law brings them to what, we would say? Repentance, exactly. It reminds them of what the law was all about and where they were. And yet the timing was such, the walls had been finished in the 6th month. In the 7th month, the first day, the Feast of Trumpets, and then the Feast of Tabernacles, which was a 7-day feast. 8 days considering the first and last days were holy convocations. So that was observed. But they still recognize that they have committed grievous sins against God. Their fathers had, their ancestors. And so we have in the 9th chapter this public confession of sin and a lengthy prayer that is led by the Levites. In it, if you can just remember a couple of main ideas. What is extolled, condoned, or not condoned, but extolled in that prayer on one hand? God's power, God's, what else? It's all about God and them. God and His power, His holiness, and as well as the fact that they had still been able to continue as a nation was a monument to God's what? His mercy. And then on the other hand, you have the people. And what about them? Their whole history. Exactly. They've been rebellious throughout their history. And so those two ideas really are prominent through the prayer. And then it ends, and they decide they want to do what? Make a what? A covenant. Is everybody awake? Do we need to get up and do some jumping jacks? Okay. All right, here we go. So they make a covenant, And as I mentioned, Nehemiah, the priests, the Levites, and leaders among the people signed this renewed covenant or agreement on behalf of the nation. It's ratified with a curse on anyone who would break it and an oath as to their loyalty to God. They pledge specifically to keep the laws, commandments relative to marriage, the Sabbath, taxes, tithes, offerings for the upkeep of the temple, and for the priests and the Levites. All right. I'm not getting this to move. We've got to wonder what's happened here. I'll have to do it manually. All right, the second is among some of these priests who sealed the document and pledged their faithfulness to the Lord will appear in later lists as the heads of priestly houses. We may even get to that in chapter 12. He gives a kind of a summary there. Okay, so in 10, what we have, we got down to, Brother Richard, you said verse 28, didn't we? Okay, so we've had the names of the representatives sealing the covenant in the first 27 verses. Nehemiah is mentioned specifically as the governor. Zedekiah, who most think was just the lengthy name of the shortened name of Zadok, who is the scribe, perhaps, well, he's mentioned in 13:13, but probably Nehemiah's scribe, his secretary. But they're mentioned first, then the priests are mentioned in 1 through 8. Then the Levites, from whom the priests would come. Several names are those who supported Ezra when he was reading from the book of the law back in chapter 8. Then the leaders are mentioned in 14 through 27. The rest of the people, which is where we are now, the rest of the people come into agreement, and it's kind of a sample. It looks like, they agree to keep all of the law. It's like we'd say, if we were children, and we had been misbehaving in a lot of different ways to mom or dad, and we had just been really, really bad, and then we came and said, Mom or Dad, I have really blown it, and I'm going to be good from here on. And then you started saying, specifically, Cooper, you've never had to do this, have you? Specifically where I blew it on this, and this, I promise you I'm not going to do those things. It's like a sampling of certain things that they were grievously in error on. They decide they're going to mention specifically. So that's where we are. And let's begin our reading in that. Chapter 10, verse 28 through 31. Angela, would you mind reading for us? Nehemiah 10, 28 through 31. Okay, all right, thank you. Notice the people are mentioned primarily. You've got the Levites, the priest, the singers, all these are their works all around what? The temple. And their wives, all of them, and likely they would represent the rest of them. Verse 29, they clave to their brethren, and here we have the curse and the oath that we mentioned in the note, that they would walk in the Lord's law, observe all of his commandments. And then here's that sampling I told you about. In verses 30 and 31, I can count at least 3 major ideas that they are specifying that they're not going to do, or at least they're going to do right. What's the first one in verse 30? Marriage. It has to do with marriage. They're not going to give their daughters to the people of the land, nor take their daughters for sons. Let's keep your finger there. Turn real quickly. back to Deuteronomy 7. Deuteronomy 7. This is the passage that you might want to keep in the back of your mind, because so much of this, I mean, in fact, we're going to see it in the 13th chapter. They're committing this, and then just 10, 12 years later, it's like, you know, did you forget again what you just committed, or what you committed that you would do? Deuteronomy 7, verse 1. When the Lord your God shall bring you into the land, and then he gives the tribes, and when he delivers them before you, verse 2, then, notice the middle part of verse 2, then utterly destroy them that thou shalt make no covenant, don't show mercy, neither shall you make marriages with them. Your daughter shall not give unto his, you'll not give to his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For, here's the reason, what? They will turn you away, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and break down their pillars and their asherim, and so on, burn their altars. In other words, when you go into the land, everything that smacked of idolatry, from idolatrous practices or the instruments by which the idol gods were worshipped, you're to get rid of it. Don't do anything that would in any sense attract you to all of that, because it's bad for you. The closest physical relation people have is what? Physical relation. Marriage. And these people here are that are wedded to their, so to speak, wedded to their idolatry, they'll draw you away from me. It's not right. And then there was a second, it's not mentioned here, but there was a second thing, and that was to maintain the purity of the seed, so to speak, the purity of the national existence, the continuity of them as a nation that would break with the priesthood, with Judah, and all of that. So there are several reasons God had. Some are specifically mentioned here. Let's go back to chapter 10 of Nehemiah. So we pledge that we will not give our daughters unto the peoples of the land, nor take our daughters for our sons. All right, what's the second thing mentioned in verse 31? Yeah, keep the Sabbath. Somebody says, well, I've got some stuff to sell you. Let me come over and let's do this. What were they to do? No, that's right. We're to bring if the peoples of the land bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we would not buy of them on the Sabbath or a holy day. And then a third thing, I think is the latter part of the verse, they would what? The sabbatical years, that's right. Where the land was to lie fallow, the people who had any debt, what would happen to that? It would be released, exactly. The property would be returned. So you had a lot of things that were going on that it's obvious they didn't keep. And so we're going to do this, and this is kind of a sampling of that. There's some other things that happen in 32 through the end that we'll talk about in just a second. But you know, these were very, very foundational to them as a nation. The way that they would, their marriages, the Sabbath itself was a reminder of the fact that it was who brought them out of Egypt. It was God. It was a weekly reminder that they had been in bondage, and it was God who brought them out to remind them. And then with the land and the Sabbath, so every area of life, you know, from the agricultural nature, the tending of the fields, their weekly observances in worship, and their marital life, it's practically envelops all their lives, governed by God. And keeping that, so he said, we're going to get back to this. It took a lot. I thought I heard a voice, and I just kept talking. Was that you, Landon? Was that you, Brother Gene? I thought I heard somebody's voice want to say something, and I wanted to finish my thought. Okay. Nobody wanted to say anything. Okay. Richard, that wasn't you, was it? Okay. All right. All right. In 32 through the end, there's the agreement to provide for the temple expenses as well as the ministers, the priests, and so on. And there's several things that are a part of this. If you'll notice in 32 and 33, that's one part. Let's read that, Richard, if you would, 32 and 3. Okay, a reason I put those two passages together is because they are going to charge kind of a self-imposed tax. They're going to charge themselves this third part of a shekel. And then verse 33 tells why, what it's to go for. The provisions of the showbread, the meal offerings, the burnt offerings, the Sabbath offerings, the new moons, the set feast, and the holy things, and for sin offerings, to make atonement for Israel and for the work of the house of God. Now, you probably are thinking with me, I'm pretty sure you are, the third part of a shekel is kind of reminiscent of something else, but it's not the same thing. What is it? You remember? Yeah, the half shekel. Keep your finger there. Turn all the way back to Exodus, the 30th chapter. Exodus 30. Exodus 30, verses 11 through 16. Lindsay, do you have that? Read that if you would. Exodus 30, 11 through 16. Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Couple of things. It's not a third of a shekel, but here it's a what? It's a half shekel. And there are 2 or 3 quick things that we want to mention about this. It's given for every person, every man, that's in verse 12, a ransom for his soul. It was a kind of a reminder that everyone needed what? Exactly. Everybody's a sinner. Everybody needs atonement. Everybody needs redemption. And so he says in verse 13, everyone is simply to pay the half shekel, and then he describes what that is. And it was for the those who were numbered, who were how old? Verse 14? 20 and above. And was it any kind of scale, or was it all the same for everybody? It was the same for everybody. Regardless if you're rich or you're poor, it was a half shekel. Most have said a half shekel was worth about a 2 days' wage for a common laborer. And so it was something most people could do. It was not just it was not nothing, but it was doable. And so it was to furnish these things that related to the tabernacle and then later the temple. It's interesting that he mentions it's to be done when the sum of the people, or when a census is taken. If you read various things on this in various dictionaries, some say it was only done, at the time that various censuses were taken. And then on others, it seemed like it's a yearly thing that was practiced. By the time of Jesus, you remember in the last paragraph of Matthew 17, somebody comes to Peter, they come to Peter and they say to Peter, does your master pay the half shekel? And Peter just went ahead and said, oh yes, he does. Then they come into a house, and Jesus said to Peter, Peter, who's responsible for, the upkeep of various things? The king's sons or the people? Well, the people, not the king's sons. And he says, he made the point. Who was actually over the temple? God, Christ. They were responsible for the instructions of it and all that. And so, but then Jesus said, in order to keep anybody from stumbling, go put your hook in the sea, get a fish, and you'll find a shekel, pay for you and me. And so he does. And the point is, it was still going on during the time of Jesus. Now, why a third shekel? I did, little things like that is really, if I can't answer it like that, I feel like it's something that really bugs me. And so I did a lot of reading, and the best I could come up with is from the NIV Study Bible. Exodus 30 speaks of a half shekel as an offering to the Lord. That's what Lindsay just read. From each man who was 20 years old or more as a symbolic ransom. Later, Joash used the annual contributions for the repair of the temple. They state there it was annual. Well, it doesn't say it was annual in the law. It was when the census was taken. But by the time there, it looks like it had become an annual thing. That kind of reminds us of United States taxes, doesn't it? They always go up. They never. In the New Testament period, Jewish men from everywhere sent an offering of a half shekel or 2 drachmas, which was its equivalent, for the temple in Jerusalem. That's stated by Josephus. I didn't put all the references, but in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, that's mentioned. Then the pledge of a third of a shekel may have been due to economic circumstances. And the economic circumstances might have been the fact either for the poverty of the people, or some make the point that with the Persians and all of that, that actually a third of a shekel was equal to a half shekel. I just don't know. But whatever the third of the shekel was, it's you can do this. You can think about, well, Nehemiah is not shortcutting God. He's not wanting to do anything wrong toward God. And so you would have to think whatever Nehemiah says, this is a good thing for us to do, must have coincided with God's overall will. And if that's the case, then this third shekel likely corresponded to the half shekel that the Jews were to pay earlier. All of which says, when they agree to do this, that evidently what? They had not been doing this for years. And of course, they'd been in captivity. We understand that. But anyway, they hadn't had a temple for it. Exactly. Yes, that's exactly right, Brother Gene. They'd not had that. So that gives us maybe a little bit more to think about in verses 32 and 33. This third shekel likely was the same as the half shekel of Exodus 30, and corresponds to what Jesus that was referenced in Matthew 17. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Back in Ezra. Mm-hmm. Nehemiah, Nehemiah 5. Yeah, Nehemiah 5. You're right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yes, we can pay this. Exactly. Good point. Yeah. Nothing changes under the sun, does it? Okay, so in this section, again, the bigger picture is that there's an agreement to provide for everything that surrounded the work around the temple. And so these various sacrifices. Now, there's a neat idea that we don't read much about in verse 34, just 34 by itself. In order for whole burnt offerings and all these other things to be consumed, what had to be going on at the tabernacle or the temple all the time? Fires had to be burning. And I read, I don't remember where it was, but somebody said, what's everybody's business becomes nobody's business. I thought that's a lot like in the church. What everybody knows needs to be done, well, anybody can do that. Anybody can bring wood, and guess what happens? It doesn't get brought. And so let's read that, Sister Eleanor, if you would, verse 34 by itself. Okay, you go back, if you want making notes, Leviticus 6, 12, and 13 is the passage that talks about the fire being burned on a continual basis. So somebody's got to get the wood. So how did they determine? They cast what? They cast lots. And so that made it somewhat equitable. All right, and then in 35 through 37, we have, there's a word that's used all the way through there. The first, yes. First fruits, firstborn, first fruits of everything. And let's read that, Sister Billy, if you would, 35 through 37. Yes, okay. So you have the first fruits of the ground, firstborn of the sons. That's interesting, guys. The firstborn of the sons. You remember the last plague is, or was, the death of the firstborn, who was considered not any more important, but had special privileges in Egypt as well as Israel. The firstborn. And so you've got the firstborn, usually also known as the right of primogeniture. The right of the firstborn, usually a double portion of the father's inheritance. It had somewhat to do with the priesthood later on. And so you had the special position of the firstborn. So in the death of the firstborn among Egypt, not only man but beast as well, what did it show? God could destroy what they considered special. What was that, Adriana? Important, that's right. What was important? What was special? God could just take that out. But among the Israelites, in the houses where the blood of the lamb had been smeared on the doorpost and the lintel, what happened? The firstborn were spared. As a result of the sparing, turn to Exodus 13 real quickly. All that's in Exodus 12, you remember, the Passover, death of the firstborn. And then if you probably have a topical heading for chapter 13 that's going where I'm going. What is it? Yes, the firstborn is especially sanctified. You'll notice in verse 1, sanctify to me the firstborn whatsoever opens the womb among the children, both of man and beast. Remember this day. It was this day that you were brought out. Then if you drop down to, a couple things I was in restudying this. You'll notice in verse 8, it shall be when your son asks you, you'll tell your son in that day, it's because of that which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. It's a sign to thee upon the hand for a memorial between thee. Then in verses 11 through 16, he talks about how they were to redeem, or in other words, the firstborn of the families was not sacrificed to the Lord in the sense of killed, but was ransomed or bought back to the family through animal sacrifices. And it's interesting in verse 14, it shall be when your son asks thee in time to come, what is this? That thou shalt say, by strength of hand Jehovah brought us out from Egypt and from the house of bondage. It's all, you just keep going back to these ideas. It's almost like every ordinance God had was to remind them of what? Their bondage. And it was God who delivered you. Therefore, you ought to be appreciative. In this section, in Exodus 13, you have this idea, okay, the firstborn of man and beast, what was destroyed in Egypt. But the firstborn of man and beast in Israel was spared. Therefore, since they were spared, there is a special debt, we might say, that is owed for them, for the firstborn that was not destroyed. And so this is what you do to consecrate. Now, it's interesting that in Colossians 1, Jesus Christ is called the firstborn of all creation. He's over all. Not that he was a created being, but he's over. He has the right of primogeniture, so to speak. In Hebrews, the 12th chapter, but ye are come to Mount Zion, to the church of the living God, the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. The firstborn there is plural. It's the idea of the firstborn ones, which indicates that Christians have the status, just like in the Old Testament, of special importance, as Adriana mentioned. They're unique. They've been especially preserved, so they are especially consecrated or dedicated to God. And so in Hebrews 12, he says that's what we are. We're special to God. And so don't go back into Judaism. Be appreciative of that fact. It was reminiscent. I was thinking about this morning. My lesson I tried to give last Sunday night on Romans 12, 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, by the mercies of God, you've been spared by the first 11 chapters, by the gospel that frees you from sin and makes you alive. I beseech you, therefore, by the mercies of God, that you present your, what? Your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable. In other words, as a result of what God's done for you, you owe God. I owe God. And that's the idea here in Exodus 13. You look like you want to say something, Landon. All right, let's go back and finish up. Our time is about gone. Back in Nehemiah, the 10th chapter, he mentions the first fruits. And then in verse 37, the latter part, the tithes of our ground unto the Levites, for they, the Levites, take the tithes in all the cities of tillage. And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites take tithes. And the Levites shall bring up the tithe of the tithes unto the house of our God. All right, everybody is to give a tithe. The Levites are to take that, and of the tithes that have been collected from the people, a tenth of that is to be given specifically to whom? The priest. So you've got the tenth among the people given to the Levites. Levites take a tenth of what's been accumulated, and that's called a tithe of the tithes unto the house of God. For the children of Israel and the children of Levi shall bring the heave offering of the grain, of the new wine, and of the oil unto the chambers where are the vessels of the sanctuary, and the priests that minister, the porters or doorkeepers, the singers, and we will not forsake the house of our God. That's a wonderful sentiment, isn't it? We're going to do this, and we're not going to go away from God. Well, that ought to be the sentiment of all of us. We're not going to go away. That's like Joshua. As for me and my house, what? We will serve the Lord. And I don't think that's tyrannical or a father's beating his kids and his wife into subjection to serve the Lord. But he says, this is our plan. This is our purpose. And we want everybody to do this. And the fathers are taking the lead in this. And in this case, Nehemiah is encouraging them to do all of this and take the lead. All right, comment, question before we stop? Landon, anything on that? Anybody? Charlie? All right, so that's what we have. In the next chapter, when we come up, we're going to have a kind of a census of the people, and we'll go from there, Lord willing, Wednesday night. Thank you for your